Hi, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time Scarlet Woman of Thelemite. And in this video, we're going to be talking all about Wicca. Wicca is a subject that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but there's so much misinformation on it, as well as Wicca sort of gets a stigma, especially in the age of the internet. When people think of Wicca, they tend to sort of associate with what we would call fluffy bunny witchcraft, or people doing things that are very love and light or new age. However, Wicca actually has an interesting history and connection to Western esotericism and is a lot more complex than people make it out to be. Because of the rise of the internet, people associate Wicca with the internet form of Wicca, which is actually not what a Wicca originally was, nor is it representative of the entire religion. So in this video, we're going to break into Wicca, its history, internet Wicca versus traditional Wicca, the different types of Wicca, the theology, the practices, and the misconceptions, and the advice for those who want to become Wiccan. So this is Georgina. I am a practicing Thelemite and ceremonial magician, and let's get started. So when we talk about Wicca, let's first define the term. So Wicca refers to a religion that began in the United Kingdom in the 1940s, which then sort of expanded into the 1950s and got bigger in the 70s and then the 90s and is now huge, by a man named Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was an occultist far before founding Wicca, though. Gerald Gardner was a member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, a Thelemic religious group that was founded by a Freemason in Germany, and then was taken over by Aleister Crowley, and under Aleister Crowley became a Thelemic organization, and to this day is one of the largest Thelemic associated groups. So Gerald Gardner was a member of the OTO, but he changed paths because he was very interested in witchcraft, which the OTO did not really teach about at the time, and so he met with a group of witches who claimed to be a long hereditary line in the United Kingdom called the New Forest Coven. In modern times, there have been a lot of sort of looking into the New Forest Coven, as many accused him of making this a false sort of story. There's been a lot of study into the New Forest Coven and whether or not that is true or not, so that's a whole discourse I don't want to get into. But basically, the New Forest Coven taught him all sorts of witchcraft. He combined it with the Thelemic teachings that he was already receiving. If you want context on what Thelemite is, I really suggest watching my Thelemite video. So Wicca became its own religion. Wicca has some very interesting principles to it. So essentially it is an attempt to revive the fertility cults of Great Britain. So it's basically a fertility religion, meaning that it's all about witchcraft and sort of the polarities of gender. When we talk about gender in a metaphysical sense, we're not talking about physical gender, right? We're not talking about genitalia, we're not talking about boys wear blue and girls wear pink, but rather metaphysical concepts. So they would sort of extract this, because in Thelemite we talk quite a bit about gender polarity and sort of the combination of the masculine and the feminine to make the androgyne and the magical child, but rather Wicca takes it to a different level and sort of creates a duotheism. So they made the conception that there is a god and a goddess, and the god represents the masculine principles, the active principles, and the goddess represents the feminine, the female, the receiving. And these became sort of the basis of the Wiccan theology. And when you go to a Wiccan event, you commonly see different deities referred to as the god and the goddess. It'll say a list of male deities, and then it'll say, and known under many other names, and that will represent the god, and the goddess will be a combination of all these feminine deities. So it's actually not like one god and one goddess, but rather the god and the goddess signify the masculine and feminine principles. Within Wicca, you see a lot of debates on whether there is hard polytheism, where each deity exists separately and entirely and are full deities on their own, or a softer polytheism, where they sort of blend together and it's more like different faces of the same thing, kind of like how the Hindu conception of deities work. Wicca, I've noticed most people lean towards soft polytheism, which is why this duotheism really connects with people, but Wicca does have some diversity in thought in terms of that. And so Wiccan rituals are very sort of focused on this unification of the opposites to create the magical child and thus create a manifestation. So yes, Wiccans do practice witchcraft, but we talk about like traditional Wiccan witchcraft. It is a little different than when we think of internet witchcraft, because while Wicca does pull from a lot of what we would call folk practice, a lot of Wiccan rites are quite ceremonial. And things like the Great Rite, the Fivefold Kiss, these sort of rites for their holidays, which are called the Wheel of the Year, which are the solstices and the cross quarters. And each of those are assigned to various deities that they syncretize across various European traditions. These rituals tend to be quite ceremonial, and it's taken even further in the Alexandrian tradition of Wicca, where things like Enochian and Solomonic magic are pulled into the Wiccan canon. Alexandrians are considered a little wacky by some, but their rituals actually incorporate quite a bit of classical ceremonial magic, and if you look at photos of their workings, you can see certain things out of planetary magic and various parts of the grimoire tradition. So it can get even more complex than that. So Wicca is obviously not just putting things in a jar, and that is not the whole of Wicca. As well, Wicca is not like a whole single group. So there are a couple types of Wiccans. There's the classic Wiccan, which is the Gardnerian Wiccan. That's Wiccans that are initiatory practice. To be a Gardnerian, you have to initiate in, and the secrets of Wicca are taught through the degrees. So Gardnerian Wicca has 3 degrees. I promise I'm holding up 3 fingers, and through those degrees you become a sort of taught Wiccan. And the Gardnerian practice is a lot of influence from Thelema, and of course the traditions that influence Thelema, such as Freemasonry, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah, you will see leaking into Gardnerian Wicca, as well as the second one that's sort of initiatory and huge that we think of immediately is Alexandrian Wicca, which is structured very similarly to Gardnerian Wicca with the same degrees. But there are some things that have been changed, like the addition of the grimoire tradition and a little bit of like mix-ups in terms of cosmology and whatnot. And then you have Dianic Wicca, which is Wicca, but instead of focusing on the gender polarity, it focuses exclusively on the feminine side. The Dianic Wiccan movement has a lot of overlap with feminism and a lot of the like women's spirituality stuff, though I will warn there have been some controversies with the Dianic Wiccan movement and transphobic issues, which I, as someone who is very pro-trans, have issues with. So if you are a trans person looking into Dianic Wicca, I would be careful. In general, Wicca can come across as a little heteronormative when we talk about the god and the goddess and gender polarity, but there's so many later Wiccans and modern Wiccans writing about the queer experience and Wicca and how you can make Wicca work for a variety of things, and sort of like a more modern take on this idea of the gender polarity that obviously like is not what we're talking about in the 50s. If you want to learn about Wicca, I suggest reading more modern writers and not only reading Gardner and the original text and the original rites associated with Wicca. So beyond that, there is what we know, probably the one that comes to your mind first, which would be Eclectic Wicca or Neo-Wicca, originally called Neo-Wicca. Eclectic Wicca is the strain of Wicca that sort of blew up on the internet in the 1990s. So original Wicca Gardnerian stuff was not super popular, but when the internet began and we have writers such as Scott Cunningham creating works, Wicca distilled into the internet and became a different thing. And it led into what we would call now modern eclectic witchcraft, because modern eclectic witchcraft has a very, very strong Wiccan influence on it. Beyond this, there are some smaller traditions, but those are sort of the big ones that come up first. So whether someone is an eclectic Wiccan or a sort of traditional Wiccan, there's going to be quite a few differences between those practices. But most people who are traditional coven Wiccans do practice solitarily as well and do not only do rituals in a group. So let's get into Wiccan practices and sort of what things that Wiccans celebrate and follow. So Wiccans observe the Wheel of the Year. The Wheel of the Year, I think anyone who's deep into occultism has heard about ad nauseum. It is the solstices and the cross quarters, and it is based off a series of European holidays. If you want to learn more about the Wheel of the Year, I really suggest the book Year of the Witch by my co-host on my podcast, Temperance, Alden. She explains it really well. Some people do take issue with the Wheel of the Year because it pulls from a variety of European holidays, and some seem to almost be fabricated by Gardner. Some we have very little historic records on, and some seem to be picked rather randomly. So there's been a lot of critiques of the Wiccan Wheel of the Year on this count, but it is a very popular thing to observe. A lot of non-Wiccans and just general pagans observe this. Ideas like celebrating the solstices and equinoxes are common in many practices, including the practice that led to Wicca called Thelema. The solstices and equinoxes are observed just in a very different way. And modern Thelemites a lot of Thelemites I've noticed do observe the Wheel of the Year that the Wiccans did. The Wiccans really knew how to party, and they added the cross quarters later on because people enjoyed these celebrations. So the cross quarters were not actually in the original Wheel of the Year. It was originally just the solstices and the equinoxes, and then later on we added all the cross quarters. As well, a thing that people bring up a lot with Wicca is the Wiccan Raid. The Wiccan Raid was by Dorian Valiente, who was an influential Wiccan but was not Gardner. So not all Wiccans observe the threefold law, which is the idea that what you do comes back on you times 3, and is sort of like a westernized, lighter version of the concepts of karma. A lot of Wiccans in their practices do big rituals. There's a lot of ceremonial ritual styles. There's big observances of these holidays. There's initiatory rites. If you were to go through the 3 degrees of classical traditional Wicca, there are initiation rites. Some of them have been leaked online, but there's a wide variety of things. As well as there are some sort of traditional Wiccan rites that get a little controversial, like the 5-fold kiss, where people kiss the 5 points on the body, and some people find that uncomfortable, but in a Wiccan context, it is desexualized. as well as there are things like the Great Rite, which signifies the unification of the masculine and feminine principles. There are a lot of things that are witchcraft and sort of material results magic. Results magic as a whole was not a super huge thing in Western esotericism until a little later, and Wicca, a lot of people who are Wiccans do a lot of what we call results magic, which is doing mystical practices for not like self-attainment, but for like material gain. Though self-attainment is very stressed in Wicca, and Wiccan practices can really help evolve the soul into a better place. In terms of misconceptions, I think the biggest misconception is that Wicca is fluffy or only one thing. A lot of people encounter internet Wicca a lot when they're a new practitioner, and they associate all of Wicca with internet Wicca, when Wicca is a little bit more diverse than what they're thinking. As well, there's some misconceptions about Wicca's age. Wicca is a newer practice, but that doesn't mean it's less valid. There are quite a few practices that actually pull from Wicca that are even younger than Wicca. New doesn't necessarily mean worse. Wicca is not ancient. While it is an attempt to do neo-paganism, so the difference between neo-paganism and pagan reconstructionism is Reconstructionism tries to accurately reconstruct exactly what ancient pagans were doing, which on a historical level is really hard to do because we don't have the records. So pagan reconstructionism tends to be pretty inaccurate too. Neo-paganism is a less like focused on making it a perfect reconstruction attempt, but rather sort of creating a new practice out of old ideas. So neither neo-paganism or reconstructionism is better because both are honest attempts on a historical level. Neither is accurate because there's no way to have accurate paganism, especially with some of the practices that Wicca pulls from, like Celtic paganism and Druidry and whatnot. Like we don't have the records to properly recreate that. So Wicca is a very earnest attempt. As well as I think Wicca gets a lot of flack for people being uncomfortable with some of the sexual stuff and sexual practices Wiccans do. If you listen to my podcast episode on Wicca on my Occultism with a Side of Salt podcast, I go really in depth into this. But we talk about like the unification of opposites and whatnot in a Wiccan context is not necessarily a sexual thing. Like there are some sexual content, but it's not meant to be like sexy or titillating. Another one is that Wicca is all women. So in the opposite of my practice, Thelema, Wicca is typically more female-centric, but Wicca is not all about the feminine. I think people, when they hear about modern witchcraft, they think of lunar deities and the divine feminine, but Wicca is all about that polarity. So there's actually a large representation of masculine energy inside of the Wiccan canon and practice. So Wicca is a bit more diverse than people make it out to be. And advice for people who want to be Wiccans, in terms of finding traditional Wiccan groups, it's very hard now during COVID, but there are some websites that catalog them, as well as Facebook and Meetup are great places to find groups. If you want to be a Gardnerian or Alexandrian Wicca, there's really no way to do that on your own because they are initiatory. So while you can find some of the rites uploaded online and whatnot, you're not going to have the full experience because it is a secretive mystery tradition in a similar way to Thelema or Golden Dawn can be at times, except even less so because a lot of these rituals are group rituals in the traditional Wiccan sense, so you can't really replicate them on your own perfectly. You can try, but it's not the same. So if you want to seek into something like Alexandrian or Gardnerian Wicca, you will need to seek initiation, and that's a bit of a process, but is something that many people go through, and there's a lot of advice for it. I really suggest the book Traditional Wicca by Thorn Mooney. In terms of going the eclectic route, I really do suggest reading a variety of Wiccan writers and not just Scott Cunningham, because what became of internet Wicca is very different from traditional Wicca, and I think even if the sort of eclectic Wicca style is more for you, you should do some research on the original style so you can have that sort of historical background and that sort of context for what like Wiccan rituals tend to look like. I also suggest, there's been some discourse about Wicca being problematic recently. I suggest listening to Wiccans on this and not trusting the hysteria that is the occult internet and doing your own research and discretion. Wicca is not for everyone, and for me personally, I am not a Wiccan. Wicca was not the right practice for me, but as someone who is a Thelemite, it's really interesting to see how Thelemic ideas turned into Wicca and how in Wicca you can see these very Thelemic concepts and ideas. So thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more of me, you can join my Patreon under .darling, and as well follow me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and I think those are all my platforms. And you can support my podcast, Occultism with a Side of Salt, an esoteric commentary podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. So thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days, you'll meet your holy guardian angel. Bye.